Hello and welcome to CrOSSTaLK, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A military alliance in search of an identity. For over 2 decades, NATO has had branding issues. To justify its existence, it absolutely needs an enemy. In the wake of the Ukraine crisis, Russia now fits that bill. To CrOSSTaLK, NATO and its future, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. In Washington, we have Brian Becker. He is the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. And here in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sloboda. He is an international affairs and security analyst. All right, gentlemen, CrOSSTaLK rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want. Mark, here in Moscow, the summit, the NATO summit, build is the most important one since the end of the Cold War has just ended in Wales. What did you take away from it?
Well, I think, and I have some experience, I served in the U.S. military, and I have a few NATO ribbons and medals on my chest from operations. I agree. I think it was an extremely significant summit. I think it's a summit that really officiated in institutional terms the return of a Cold War, quote unquote, 2.0, obviously with vastly different geopolitical horizons, now mostly focused on Russia's borders. I think the most significant development out of it, I think you could come to two of them. The first one is the creation of this spearhead rapid reaction force, which will be permanently stationed at new bases created in Eastern Europe. This will be a huge security concern for Russia, and it will lead to counter reactions, and it creates a standing NATO military army, essentially, for the first time, not just contributions by member states. They will be permanently operating, training, and stationed together. Second of all, despite this, the second biggest important thing to consider out of the Wales summit is that despite these lofty ambitions, they haven't really come down to terms of who and how they're going to pay for it, because the creation of this is going to be quite expensive. So the ambition is there. The rhetoric is there. I can't remember how many times I heard Russia and ISIS being lumped together into the same sentence as threats to the world out of this All
right, let me go to Alexandra in London. I have a different take from it. I think it was just a lot of noise coming out of that summit there. NATO has something to do finally. Wonderful. It already has plenty of things to do. Disasters like Libya, like Afghanistan. I mean, I really can't take it seriously. I can't. Maybe, you know, okay, Poland will have a military base. Wow, big deal. Go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't think one can completely disregard all of this. I mean, I think one point I would make is that, to my mind, NATO has always been basically an anti-Russian alliance. What has now changed is that that fact has now become, frankly, official. Russia has been called an aggressor. It has been named as a threat. We've heard about a rapid deployment force being deployed in Poland, which, by the way, violates an international treaty that was made with Russia. So I don't think one can just say this is completely, no, absolutely nothing, it's just rhetoric. We are seeing a hardening, a very real hardening of positions, and a very real hardening of the rhetoric. What I would say, though, is that despite all this hardening of rhetoric, and this is where I do tend to lean towards you, when you actually look at what they are materially doing, it is not so significant. I don't think this rapid deployment force is actually going to be a great threat to Russia. That's my own personal take on it. I think what it will do, though, however, is create a very certain cooling, or actually worse than cooling, increasing the tensions in the international situation in Europe.
Okay, Brian, one of the interesting things, though, is that, NATO has its plans. It has a mission now. It's officially anti-Russia. What does this do for Ukraine? Because I don't see how it helps Ukraine whatsoever. And this is where it all started from, at least officially.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real context for the current summit is Ukraine and the civil war, which is a real civil war, and you have the Ukrainian government basically frustrated by its military efforts to crush the opposition in the east and southern part of Ukraine. The offensive that they started on July 1st turned into a debacle, and instead of being able to crush the opposition and completely corner Russia, just the opposite happened. They suffered major military setbacks in the recent weeks. And so the basis for the ceasefire agreement, whether it holds or not, we'll see, which took place at the NATO summit, took place in the context of this shift in the military relationship of forces. There's that part of the story, which I think in many ways is the fundamental story, because Ukraine remains, I believe, the flashpoint for a possible larger and I believe catastrophic conflict between the West and Russia. Even though neither side wants war, they've both climbed the escalation ladder. In the case of the United States and NATO, they provoked the situation by overthrowing a legitimate sovereign government with a coup. And then that precipitated a civil war, and both sides have been able to see in that civil war their own geostrategic interests. But the U.S. recklessly, and using NATO as its instrument, recklessly pushing this thing right to the brink until they were set back militarily in the last few weeks. What's the short-term and the long-term outcome of the summit? I'd say short-term, we have a temporary ceasefire. Long-term, it's being used by those forces in Poland, in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Britain, and the United States, the neoconservatives, to turn NATO into a more aggressive force against Russia and, in defiance of the 1997 treaties, creating military bases right on Russia's border. Now, and it's de facto military bases. They can say it's a rotational force. Nonetheless, it's a military base in defiance of that treaty. That sets the stage for a greater conflict in the future. And I think we are going to see a greater conflict in the future because of the inherent expansionist nature of NATO, not because it's NATO, not because it's that collection of countries, but because it's an instrument of an expansionist U.S. foreign policy. And even though Russia, I mean, even though France and Germany are reluctant, don't want this to be happening, would rather change course, driving it behind it is the war party, including the neoconservatives in Washington, in the Pentagon, and they have the upper hand right now.
Okay. Mark, here in Moscow, Obama, when he was speaking with Poroshenko, he mentioned over and over again Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which means, collective security. But he was reminding Poroshenko, and I don't think everyone in our audience understood it, is that we're not going to fight for you, Ukraine. Okay? He made it very, very clear. Again, this is what is the purpose of all of this? A great deal of what Brian has said is absolutely true. It's just creating escalation for no reason whatsoever. It's creating a security risk that was not there before. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. Certainly from the Russian side, this will be viewed as a provocation. What Obama was saying with reference to the Article 5, I think has been obvious from the beginning. This is the third time he has officially said that the U.S. will not confront Russia militarily in the Ukraine. And I think that in itself, in a way, does help de-escalate the situation, draw back from some of the rhetoric that's saying that a World War III is likely to result out of this. Accidents, of course, can still happen, as when so many military forces are combined. But not only is the spearhead force is 4,000 troops. That in itself is not significant. As was said, it's the precedent of the establishment of the bases and the ability to draw on that. I think the logical, probable response from Russia, which is inevitable in return, is that Russia will probably withdraw from the short-range ballistic nuclear missile treaty and will reinstate short-range missiles, in the face of what is, frankly, overwhelming conventional force from NATO right on its borders. And the most provocative thing, though, is that in the midst of a civil war in the Ukraine, the U.S. And NATO members will still continue with war games this month in western Ukraine, in Lvov on the Polish border. 1,400 troops. This is immensely provocative. And Russia is going to have to respond in some way.
Alexander, it is really a pity here after all of the treaties that have been signed here, and we just heard one about intermediate range missiles here. I mean, this is taking apart the security order in Europe. It's not building anything whatsoever. And one has to wonder, too, is how much more individual NATO countries are going to help this regime in Kiev that is floundering right now and that could actually face another Maidan. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, can I just first of all say about Ukraine? Ukraine is a textbook example of what NATO does. It doesn't do any good, but it has done an enormous amount of harm. There would not have been a civil war and a crisis in the Ukraine of the sort we are seeing now if the policies of NATO, expanding NATO continuously, pushing it towards Russia, had not happened. And I think that's something, you know, when we talk about NATO being powerless, I mean, we see the actual harm and damage it does. Now, in terms of security, and if we go all the way back, if we wind all the way back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, the whole effort then, which, let us remember as well, started with initiatives made by the Russian side, was to de-escalate the situation in Europe. There was talk at that time of Europe, our common home, and this was what the whole direction of policy seemed to be all about. NATO preserved itself, which made little sense, in fact, given that the Cold War ended. It broke promises.
Okay, Alexander, on that note here, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on NATO and its future. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrOSSTaLK, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing NATO and its future. Okay, I'd like to go back to Brian in Washington. Brian, in reflecting upon NATO's past since the end of the Cold War, it's had a number of out-of-area operations, as they like to call it, a euphemism. They've been involved in Afghanistan. They've been involved in Libya, both catastrophes, but weak countries that could not defend themselves against the West. But Russia is very different. And I think if you look at, you know, I'm not going to be a cheerleader for Vladimir Putin, but I'm just going to say if you read what he says, he does what he says, okay? And he's basically making it very clear that NATO shouldn't trifle with Russia because there can be very serious consequences. Again, Russia's not a poor country that can be easily destroyed. Russia's different, and NATO is miscalculating. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, there's been miscalculation after miscalculation after miscalculation during the last year. If you had had this show a year ago and said, will there be a civil war in the Ukraine? Will there be a geostrategic crisis, possibly a global confrontation?
They would put us all in a mental institute. Yeah, they would put us all in a mental institute, exactly.
Right.
Go ahead.
I said it 5 years ago.
Yeah, nobody...
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, nobody would have believed this. This was the consequence of reckless, ridiculous, irresponsible, nearsighted policies pushed by the neoconservatives, Victoria Nuland, John McCain, and you had the and John Kerry, and you had the Obama administration, Obama himself, sort of acquiescing, disappearing, and allowing this to happen. So there was no anticipation of what would happen now. These are unintended consequences. But that ridiculous, stupid, nearsighted thinking takes place in a strategic framework, and that strategic framework isn't stupid, it's real. And it's been going on for 20 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is the organic and full court press on Russia by gobbling up all of Eastern and Central Europe, all the former allies of the Soviet Union or the allies of Russia. And what's causing that? It's not because Russia is big and bad and it has been an aggressor. It's because there is an inherent expansionism where the United States in particular sees in Eastern and Central Europe and in parts of Russia what it saw in Africa or what it saw in Latin America or Asia, valuable parts of the world that can be gobbled up and turned into a sphere of influence for maybe not colonial domination, but a kind of neo-colonialism. And as that process has unfolded, it can't but be perceived by the Russian government, any Russian government, as a direct threat to Russia's geostrategic interests and its national interests, its core interests.
You know, Mark, Brian said something very, very valuable there when we reflect upon what we see in media all the time and what are said in the halls of power in the West, is that, you know, it's this demonization of Putin. But the fact of the matter is these are real geopolitical interests that Russia are pursuing. It doesn't matter who is president of this country. They're going to, that president and its government will protect its national interests. This is a really interesting point that Brian brings out, because it's not about one man.
Well, the United States, which of course is the driving force behind NATO, has the belief that no other country in the world is allowed national interests, certainly not outside their own borders and sometimes not even within them. And the United States' national interests extend globally to the entirety of the world. And this was alluded to by President Putin in 2007 in Munich, when he said that the United States' obsession for absolute security demands the absolute vulnerability of every other country in the world. And this Putin's statement at that time hasn't led to any lessening of that. We've seen it further. And I'd like to disagree a little bit with what Alexander Mercouris said earlier, in that NATO is a useless organization because of its own actions. And I disagree. That's only true if you consider that the mission of NATO is, as is officially stated, simply as a collective security organization. It's been clear since the 90s that this is not true, that the real purpose of NATO, with its out-of-area missions, which have been the only, NATO has never operated defensively. Never. It has always, all of its military operations have been out of area, have been aggressive operations. The real purpose of NATO is to extend the transatlantic security structure to the rest of the world, what we can only rightly call global military hegemony, and it has acted somewhat effectively in enforcing this.
Okay, well, if I go back to London here, Alexander, I mean, if we look at these out-of-area operations, it's done in the name of NATO, but not all NATO countries participate in it. And this is one of the things, I'm kind of leaning to your side, because it's certain countries that use NATO as a fig leaf to do exactly what Mark just said to us. Go ahead, Alexander.
Yes, well, I would agree with that. I mean, there are some countries within NATO that are not at all keen on these operations. The problem is they've not been very successful in acting as a force of restraint on the others. But if we look at Libya, it was essentially an American, British, French operation. The other NATO countries were hardly involved. If one looks at Iraq before, well, of course, many countries in NATO refused to be involved at all. And if we look to Afghanistan, again, overwhelmingly, it is the United States. One point I would make in response to Mark is I didn't say that NATO was a useless organization. What I said was it is a harmful organization. It does a great deal of harm. It is creating tensions in Europe where those have no objective reasons to be. And as we've just discussed, it provides a fig leaf for all sorts of adventures all around the world, in the Middle East and elsewhere, which have done enormous damage to the places where they have been carried out.
Brian, it's been said that Rome conquered the world in self-defense, and I suppose that this is what the United States believes as well. And NATO is its fig leaf. If NATO doesn't expand, then it has to be dismantled.
Exactly, and you know, let's go back too and think about why wasn't Russia invited to join NATO at the end of this Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed? Why not just bring them in? I mean, Yeltsin's orientation was very pro-Western. I mean, why not just bring them in? The reality is that if Russia was admitted as an equal, in other words, which would what NATO membership would mean, then you'd see France and Germany and other European countries gravitating towards Russia. The only way the U.S. can maintain its sort of hegemony over the world, that which it established at least in the capitalist world after World War II, is to keep a complete bloc, a unity. And for that purpose, they need an enemy. They need to keep Germany and France within the range of U.S. domination, and that would not be the case. So Russia's needed as an enemy for several purposes. One, it expands the military-industrial complex. It allows the expansionist position of the Western forces. There are political lobbies like the neoconservatives who constantly cheerlead for it. But ultimately, if Russia was an equal, then the matter of U.S. hegemony that was established really predominantly after World War II, that would start to shatter because there would be a new new relationships that would form in Europe and elsewhere. And the U.S. doesn't want that. So it needs permanent hostility with Russia in order to discipline the so-called NATO allies, some of whom don't want this to be happening, specifically Germany and France.
Mark, reflect upon that. And NATO needs an enemy, and the best enemy they could find is Russia, because Russia does push back.
Well, NATO does need an enemy constantly, all right, and it fits with their expanded goals that we've talked about. But I have to disagree. I don't think that Plan A for the United States for, driving NATO is to have Russia as an enemy. Plan A is for Russia to align its foreign policy and national interests with the United States as part of the transatlantic structure, assume its role within the hegemony, and help the United States to contain China in what is viewed as a future inevitable geopolitical conflicts with China. However,
I just want to say for Mark, Mark, I don't believe that there's any force within the United States foreign policy establishment that actually believes that Russia's interests can be harmonized with U.S. interests for that perspective. I just don't see that anywhere.
Mark, go ahead.
Certainly not with President Putin at the helm, and that is the big problem, is that Putin has reasserted Russian national interests and geopolitical interests as being separate from the United States. Not necessarily confrontational. Putin has never necessarily wanted that, but within a rule-based post-1945 structure as determined by the UN Charter. And the United States is no longer operating within those rules. So Putin presents the obstacle.
I agree.
The United States would like to remove Putin from power, but of course one man won't change Russia. And that is the big mistake, is that they assume that it's Putin driving Russia rather than Russia driving Putin.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexander, you want to agree or disagree there? Go ahead.
I want to agree with that completely. I should add that what I think many people in America do not understand is that within Russia, Putin is, if anything, a voice for moderation in response to a lot of this. There are many people in Russia who feel Russia ought to be taking a much harder line than the one it is. But I think what Brian said previously does contain a lot of truth to it. NATO is a structurally and institutionally anti-Russian organization. It has to be, because if Russia ever were to be inside it, it would inevitably form an alternative pole to the United States. So what the United States essentially wants is a Russia which is outside NATO, and which NATO is hostile to, and at the same time subservient, in the way Marx says, to its policies. That was what it tried in the 1990s. That was what utterly failed in the end. And that is something the United States doesn't seem to be able to understand is impossible.
All right, gentlemen, fascinating discussion. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London, Washington, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.